Thousands of Jewish mothers and fathers saw the escalating violence and discrimination against Jews in Nazi Germany 85 years ago and made the almost unimaginable decision to say goodbye to their children in order to save them. The parents fought every instinct and kissed their children as if it were the last time before sending them away. The shock and grief was unmistakable on some of their faces. Others bravely waved and smiled, telling their children they were headed for a grand adventure. Today, we'll commemorate the anniversary of the Kindertransport, one of the largest international efforts to rescue children from the Nazi threat. The rescue effort helped save 10,000 children from the Nazis and find them homes in Great Britain. Good afternoon. I'm your host, Dr. Becky Belding. Our guest today is Deborah Oppenheimer, who won an Academy Award in 2001 for her film Into the Arms of Strangers, Stories of the Kindertransport. Welcome, Deborah. We're really pleased to have you with us today.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
So to get started, Deborah, your film really introduced a lot of people to the story of the Kindertransport, but it also helped you understand your own family story better. Can you talk a little bit about that and what inspired you to make this film?
Yeah, my mother was one of the children rescued by the Kindertransport. I always knew that had happened, but she was unable to mostly talk about her story. Her parents had been killed in the concentration camps, and she just told me a couple of things. She told me she lived in a castle with the Lord and Lady, but it didn't sound like the fairy tale one would imagine. And she told me that she cried herself to sleep every night for 2 years. After she passed away quite young, and I came home to mourn with my family and for her funeral, my father came to me with a stack of tissue-thin letters and said, "You're sentimental, you might want these." And it turns out that they had been hidden in a drawer. He didn't even know they existed. And they had been written every day by my grandparents after they had put her on the train. So that helped to provide a timeline. I learned that my mother was only 11 years old and that she left shortly after her birthday in the final weeks of the Kindertransport, just a couple of weeks later, and she would not have been able to be saved. And it sent me down a path to begin to research what happened to my mother, what was the Kindertransport, and what happened to my grandparents.
That's pretty incredible. What did you learn about the relationship? Because you had never met your grandparents, obviously. So what did you learn about the relationship between them and your mother from the letters?
Well, the first thing to your point is that it brought them to life for me. They called her my little mouse, and I could see how loved she was. And they tried very hard to parent her from afar, to keep up an appearance of normalcy and to conceal from her the hardships that they were undergoing, that my grandfather had lost his business and that they were trying to search in every direction to get out, but without finding a path.
Wow, that's incredible. To help explain the lengths that your grandparents and other parents would go to protect their children, let's talk a little bit about the historical backdrop to your film. In November 1938, the Nazis orchestrated an attack on Jews known as Kristallnacht. In German-controlled territories, police arrested thousands of Jewish men and stood by as thugs burned synagogues and looted private homes owned by Jews. In response to the worldwide news coverage of this violence, British refugee organizations, both Jewish and non-Jewish, lobbied their government, which ultimately agreed to temporarily admit children under the age of 17, no adults, through a new program. Children were placed with foster families, with distant relatives, or in group homes. This policy became known as the Kindertransport, and it saved lives, but it also forced parents to make really an unimaginable choice. Let's hear from some of the survivors you interviewed for the film, describing their separation from their parents.
The parting was terrible. That's the one thing I've never forgotten in all my life. And she had been so controlled. She'd always been a sort of solid support to us. And suddenly she showed her feelings. And it was terrifying, really terrifying. And you saw this face which showed all hurt and agony she'd been through. And I can still see my father that mealtime, but I would have liked to have had a happier image of my mother. That's the only image of this contorted face full of agony. It's very sad.
And I remember standing by the window and waving goodbye and just trying very hard to believe that we really will come back, that it won't be for very long. But when the train moved and they disappeared from sight, both Vera and I cried in each other's arms.
My parents ran along the train on the platform, and I still remember it sort of in my head. I heard that refrain, "You're leaving, you're leaving, you're leaving." And I watched their faces, and tears were streaming down their face, down their cheeks. And I knew then, these people really love me. This is why they're sending me away.
I mean, we're hearing about this from the perspective of people who were children at the time, but as an adult, I'm thinking about it now from the perspective of the parents. Can you kind of share some of the ways that the parents emotionally tried to prepare to separate from their children?
This took place back in a time when children were seen and not heard, and you didn't explain everything to your children. So it was really complex emotionally. It was the greatest act of love, but for many of the children, it felt like abandonment. So Hetty Epstein, who you heard in that clip, thought her parents didn't love her, and it wasn't until they saw those tears streaming down her face that she realized it. Eva Heyman talks about her parents trying to pack all this wisdom and guidance into this very, very brief period that they thought that they were going to have a lifetime to give her, because the Kindertransports came together quite quickly. So there was this rush of preparations. What do you pack when you're restricted to one suitcase and one rucksack, and you're sending your child to an unknown destination to live with unknown people for an unknown length of time? So they sent their best clothing and they sent mementos, but you weren't allowed to pack any valuables or they would be confiscated. And so I think everything was intended to keep things calm, because otherwise, how else would they have gotten the children on the train?
I think you pointed out something really important, which is how fast this all happened. The anniversary of the arrival of the first Kindertransport is December 2nd, 1938, which is only about 3 weeks after the violence of Kristallnacht. And so this was a very fast decision, and it was a very clearly difficult one. The separation was incredibly painful and uncertain, even if the Kindertransport was a lifeline for these families. Children are leaving their parents, they're leaving everything familiar, they're leaving their language, and they're embarking on a new and uncertain life. It was probably the first time a lot of them had ever traveled without their parents. And yet we think about these children who were accepted on the Kindertransports as the lucky ones. More than 1.5 million Jewish children died during the Holocaust. Let's personalize this for a second. Let's look at the story of one child. Deborah, can you tell us a little bit about how Lori Siegel ended up on the Kindertransport?
Sure. Lori was 10 years old. She came from Vienna, so she was on the first transport out of Austria on December 10th. And her parents, after the annexation of Austria by Germany, went down to the bank to withdraw their money, like many, many other people in Austria, but the bank was closed. And when she went out onto the street with her parents, she was an only child. She saw banners, Nazi banners, unfurled and hanging the lengths of building. She saw people with the swastika armband with their hand raised in a Nazi salute. And this all happened overnight. But although that caught her attention, she didn't know what it meant. What she realized was the haste with which her parents rushed her back into the house. That's how she knew something was wrong. Her parents did not initially agree about what to do. Her father was the one who took charge, and her mother didn't agree, and eventually became persuaded that they had to send her away and that that was the right decision. And Lori and her father went and stood in line for hours among hundreds of other parents and children to secure a place.
It had to be so difficult. I want to take a minute and pause and welcome some of our viewers from Western Massachusetts, from Linden, Alabama, from Flatwoods, West Virginia, Churchville, New York, and Des Plaines, Illinois. Thank you so much for joining us today. Deborah, there's a detail from Lori's experience in the film that has really stuck with me, because you talked about the line and how many children are vying for these places. And she talks in the film about her twin cousins who were not chosen for the Kindertransport, and how her aunt was visibly upset about this and desperate. Let's hear Lori describe a moment from her father from her going away party.
There was a moment that my father took me between his knees and he said, now when you get to England, you have to talk to all the English people you meet and you have to ask them to get your mother and me out and your grandparents. And because this aunt was there and had been so unhappy and so angry, he said, and aunts so-and-so's twins. Before long, I had a list of people whom I, at 10 years old, had promised to save from Hitler.
I mean, that's such a big responsibility to put on such a young kid. Was this common? Were a lot of kids asked to save their relatives?
Well, it certainly wasn't uncommon. I read many, many, many letters where I could actually see the parents imploring their children to try to help them get out. The war had begun. All avenues were closed off, and the parents were searching in every direction to every country. And so they hoped that their child could be appealing and could win over the hearts of the foster parents or other people whom they had met in England. And that was very complicated for a child because the children were also sent off being told to be obedient, to behave themselves. And so how do you reconcile what the children knew was this enormous, enormous responsibility? And it was very complicated for them.
Yeah, it's so much to ask. We have a comment from a viewer named Alan who says that his mother was rescued by the Kindertransport as well in 1938 from Vienna. And she was very lucky. Her mother was able to leave Austria in the days before the start of the war. And so they were able to reunite. Did that happen with Lori? Did she also attempt to save her family? What happened there?
Well, Lori went on to become a very successful, very recognized, fantastic writer of a book called Other People's Houses. And so this was the first emergence of her writing abilities. And she did write an emotional, persuasive letter. She felt that every moment that she wasn't working on getting her parents rescued was wasted time. And so she wrote this letter. The letter did get to the attention of the proper authorities. And her parents were able to get out on what was called a domestic visa, a visa that permitted them into England if they were to be servants. So her father was the head accountant at a bank. He was certainly not equipped to be a butler. And he made mistakes, and so they put him in the garden, thinking he couldn't do any harm there. And he was already ailing by then, and she could see the weight on his shoulders of this job. And her parents were put in in a maid's room. There was no door on the room. And so the child was looking at this loss in stature for their parents. So on the one hand, it was a very happy reunion, but the children weren't allowed to live with the parents either. So they were at great distance from them.
It really shows how desperate her parents must have been to being really willing to take anything, just enabled to get out. Let's listen to Lori reminisce about reuniting with her parents.
And my parents appeared miraculously in Liverpool on my 11th birthday. And I remember feeling that some terrific weight that I had been carrying and hadn't known I had been carrying was taken off my back.
As you said, the reunion was fairly bittersweet because her parents were still trying to make ends meet. They couldn't live together. And during the war, Lori was bounced around to different foster homes. She was ultimately able to live with her mother, but her father, who, as you said, was already ailing, passed away before the end of the war. And so the family was never really able to live in peace. And I think that shows us that escape from Germany and reunion did not necessarily mean a happy ending, did it?
Mm-mm. No, that was one of the great discoveries for me of the film, because I always thought if my mother reunited with her parents, that would have been wonderful. But I learned in the making of the film that that was not always successful. The children are gone from their parents 5 years, 6 years, in some cases even more. They left as children, and they were forced to mature in Great Britain and to take care of themselves. So the parents returned, where the parents did survive, the parents returned to a much changed child, and the parents had been through a lot, and so the parents had changed also. The children, in many cases, were so eager to assimilate that they lost their language. The parents looked different to them, and so it was by no means successful for all the children, and not the very happy ending that we would expect.
Yeah, I think both sides of the family must have undergone so much trauma that it's really hard to come back together again. You're really trying to form a new relationship at that point.
The familial bonds were broken.
Yeah. We have a question from someone named Simone, and I'm not sure you know the answer. I'm not sure I know the answer. She'd like to know, do we have any idea of how many of the 10,000 Kindertransport children were placed in a Jewish environment where they could practice their religion?
I don't have those numbers, but it is a good question to raise, because there were certainly children who were placed in homes not of their culture, not of their heritage, and where they weren't able to continue what the upbringing that they had at home.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I'm not sure of the exact number either, Simone, but I think it goes a little bit back to the point that Deborah made earlier about the children being told to behave. So if a child was sent away and told, keep kosher, keep your religion, and then is placed in a Christian household where they don't keep kosher, you know, what happens then? And I think that put a lot of these children in just another really stressful situation.
Well, and also there weren't enough Jewish families
Right.
that had come forward. So the intention was get them out and save them somehow.
Right. Exactly right. And the Kindertransport was, on its whole, a very rare demonstration of generosity during the Holocaust. There are thousands of children who come, and that means thousands of families who are taking in a foster child. But that is not always a pretty picture either. There were some children who had horrendous experiences with their foster families. Some were taken by families who abused them or expected them to become maids or servants for the rest of the family. And so even children who were taken in by really loving families were all experiencing some level of trauma. Let's move on for a second to a story of a man who put himself at risk. He stayed in Germany with his wife so that he could help arrange the rescue of thousands of children. Deborah, can you tell us a little bit about a real hero named Norbert Wollheim and how he became involved with the Kindertransport?
Yeah, Norbert Wollheim was an extraordinary man who I feel honored to and privileged to have met. We heard about him. We were very eager to get a rescuer, and there were very few left alive at the time. He had been a 25-year-old social worker in Berlin, and he, like everybody else, was searching for how to get out. And he was asked to come and help organize these Kindertransports that, as we said, arose so quickly, and there were thousands of applicants to process and trains to organize, and interfacing with the British and the Germans and planning everything. And he traveled with these. He agreed to do this because Otto Hirsch, who was one of the men leading the Kindertransports in Germany, promised to help Norbert with his efforts to get out, which he was going to have to put to the side while he did this work. And Norbert actually traveled with these Kindertransports and saw every train off that left Germany, and went with them as an escort in some instances to England, where he could have been safe. But he didn't remain there. He returned to Germany and to all that he would be facing there, because he didn't want to endanger the project, the other people, and to bring an end to the Kindertransport.
Yeah, so really what you're saying is he sacrificed his own immigration. He was on his way to try to leave. He decided to stay to help. And then as he was an escort, he was literally touching freedom,
Yes.
and then going back so that he could continue to save the lives of others.
Right.
One of the things that we discovered when we were researching this program is that Norbert and his wife actually had a son around this time, in the midst of his work with the Kindertransport. And I think that must have kind of made him empathize even more with the parents he's watching say goodbye to the children. As you said, his priority was making sure that these rescue efforts could continue. And he and some of the other aid workers were fearful that if any of the parents made a scene at the departure, the police would cancel any remaining Kindertransports. So Norbert told the parents they had to say goodbye. Sometimes they weren't allowed on the platform, or they had to say goodbye out of public view. Let's listen to Norbert describe one of the many partings that he witnessed.
So there were tears, and there was laughter, and there were hugging and kissing. But, and it was a tense situation, no doubt, but most of the children were in some kind of a mood of expectation. And the parents tried to control their emotions, to show that they are courageous, in order to make it more difficult for the children. And very often after that, I have asked myself the question, where did I take the courage from to tell these people to say goodbye? And the answer to that is that none of us, nobody of us, could foresee, even at this moment, that for most of the children and most of the parents, it would be the last goodbye. That a year and a half later or so, from over the same railways, where the train left to take the children to a new country and to freedom and liberty, the trains would roll towards the east and take the parents to the human slaughterhouses and Auschwitz and other places.
The Kindertransport came to a halt on September 1st, 1939, the day that Germany invaded Poland. Great Britain declared war, and transportation between the two warring countries virtually stopped. So what happened to Norbert after the rescue effort ended?
Well, Otto Hirsch, who had assured him with the best of intentions that he would receive help, unfortunately could not fulfill that, because he was deported to Mauthausen and killed there. And Norbert and his wife and his 3-year-old son were deported to Auschwitz in 1943. At the selection, his wife and son were sent in one direction, and Norbert was sent in another, and he suffered the awful irony of having rescued thousands of children and not being able to save his own son. After the war, Norbert organized groups of displaced persons, and he remarried. He married a woman named Charlotte, and they had 2 sons, and 2 children, and they came to the United States in 1952. He spent his life working with other survivors to bring attention to survivors and to tell the story of the Holocaust. We knew he was quite ill when we interviewed him, so we raced to get his testimony on tape. And 5 weeks later, he passed away. You can't tell from the movie that he's ill at all. And his wife, Charlotte, said that he rallied himself for one final testimony, and having accomplished it, he felt sufficiently at peace to let go.
I'm so glad you have that testimony. He was a really incredible man. He saved thousands of children through his work with the Kindertransport, but as you said, ultimately was not able to save his first son.
Yes.
How did he reflect on that? How did he reconcile kind of what he achieved for these other children with what he himself had lost?
I think he believed that nobody could have foreseen what was going to happen in Germany. I think he believed that his survival, he said that his survival was a matter of luck, but he believed that if England was willing to take in all these children, it proved that there was still humanity left somewhere. And so he wanted to be part of that effort. He recognized the importance of it. And I think he felt at peace that he did that.
I think that's a really beautiful quote, this idea of if there's humanity in some place, there's still some hope. That goes well with a question that we're getting in from the audience. Nicola wants to know if your research included the perspective of any of the foster families. Did you talk to any of them or about their decision to take in a child?
Yeah, and in our film, I'm really happy you raised this question because I did want to make the point that there are some very positive, successful placements where the children stayed in touch with their families throughout their lifetime, and where the siblings in the family became their siblings. And in our movie, we have one of these examples with a man named Kurt Fischel and Mariam Cohn, who took him in. And I hope you'll get to see that story, and what a good placement that was.
Yeah, I think the story of the Kindertransport always makes me think about what I would have done, and I think that story asks all of us to ask this question of
We asked that
ourselves.
question of every one of the survivors in the movie, and they wouldn't answer that question because it was so big that they didn't feel they could put themselves in their parents' shoes. But we made this film wanting to provoke the question: would you take in a child? Would you send your child away?
Yeah, what would you do to save a child?
Yeah.
Um, as we close today, I think it's worth thinking about the Kindertransport survivors, about their parents, about the families who took them in, and about people like Norbert who really risked his life and the lives of the other aid workers who risked their lives to help these children find refuge. Deborah, what do you think we can take away from learning about their experiences?
I think there's a lot to take away, but one thing that I think about quite often is that, as you mentioned earlier in the talk, there were 1.5 million children killed in the Holocaust. 10,000 were saved by the Kindertransport. Of those 10,000, two went on to win the Nobel Prize: Arno Penzias in Palo Alto and Walter Cohn in Santa Barbara. I find it unfathomable to imagine what was lost.
Me too. Gretchen would like to say, I just want to send thanks to Deborah for creating such a beautiful film that helps all of us understand this extraordinary event and the impact on so many families. Thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing some of the remarkable stories that you learned. And I hope this is also a way to honor the memory of your mother and your grandparents. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
The Library of Congress has chosen Into the Arms of Strangers for its National Film Registry, so these stories are preserved and will be preserved for all time. The Kindertransport demonstrates what's possible when ordinary people, average British citizens in this case, decide to open their arms and offer hope. It also shows the absolutely extraordinary lengths that parents will do to protect their children. Thank you for watching today as we commemorate the anniversary of this effort that saved thousands of children from the Nazi threat.